to the special CNBC Africa broadcast. I'm Nozi Pombanjwa. We're coming to you from Gallagher Estate. We're at the Gauteng Infrastructure Investment Conference for 2017. Now, this has been a two-day affair where in the first day, quite a lot of emphasis was focused on investing in infrastructure in the Gauteng City Region. A key outcome of these conversations has been looking at how do we deconstruct structural barriers that impede or constrain investment into the city region and, of course, more broadly into the African continent. And as we change our focus for today, the focus really becomes looking at not only at African cities and the extent to which they are poised to attract investment, but also having a deeper understanding on how to do business in the African context. We've heard this morning from the Premier of the Gauteng Province, Premier David Makura, and we'll also be hearing from the Minister of Tourism, Minister Klasa, who will really be talking to us about how to attract both investors and tourists into the province and certainly into the broader country. So do stay tuned. And remember, if you're watching from home and you want to be a part of this conversation, all you need to do is just get onto Twitter. Our hashtag for today is hashtag GIIC2017. We'd love to hear your questions and your comments as we have this conversation. We're going to be having a lead discussant in this conversation, and that's Professor Ronald Wall from the University of the Witwatersrand, who's really going to be scoping and giving us the context in terms of the extent to which African cities are poised to attract investment. And thereafter, my responding panelists who are sitting right here next to me. Right next to me, I have Mr. Mustafa Abdul Ahmed, the Permanent Secretary responsible for Overseas Affairs and Investment from the city of Lagos in Nigeria, and again, giving us a continental flair in the conversation. We're also pleased to have joining us here Bernadette Zyla. She is the head of international trade at the Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce. And Rashid Sidat is the head of planning at the Gauteng City Region Observatory. And again, is going to be bringing us this key element of planning that comes into the conversation. At this moment, I'd like to call on Professor Ronald Wall to give us his context-setting remarks and really to begin to scope the conversation that we're going into. Professor Wall, it's over to you.
I'm going to be showing you work that I've been developing for the UN, the State of African Cities report, which will be coming out at the end of the year. It will be the 2018 report, but it will be available already in October of this year. And it's actually going to be called the Geography of Investment in Africa. So it will be looking at investment into countries, but also into cities. So it's quite unique, covering thousands of cities and towns in Africa and based on real data. So what you're going to see today is some snapshots out of a 300-page report. And of course, I can never deal with all the aspects, but I've picked a few things which would be useful for you and especially for us thinking about how to develop African cities, the role of foreign investment in that, and then, of course, specifically what that would mean for Gauteng. To put it in a theoretical context, this just shows you, in some quotes, the importance of development of cities in Africa. So, firstly, the improvement of the quality of lives for people in Africa is essential. And that's one of the quotes from the African Development Bank, that a lot of attention has to be put into that, especially if investment means anything into the reduction of poverty. The second quote is just saying that urbanization is becoming more and more important in the world and also in Africa, so we have to take heed of that. And also economic growth is being driven in world cities, but also in Africa now, so large shares of the GDP are being determined now by cities like Lagos and Johannesburg. Of course, what would that mean? We would have to leverage urbanization for structural transformation, and that would have to address issues like high productivity, inclusive growth, economic diversification, so of different industrial sectors, and also getting value-added activities and especially how to deal with our resources in a more efficient way. So that's from the urban agenda. The next part is that, great, we have to do all this thing, but even if we just want to address investment in infrastructure in Africa, we're talking about billions of dollars that have to be put in place to start creating the infrastructure needed to mobilize African urbanization and to connect the continent. Then the last quote is very important, comes from a lot of research, not just mine, is we have to start to realize that planning and developing a city is not only about what you do within the city's boundaries or within the region's boundaries, it's about understanding how all cities in the system are connected to each other through flows of capital, like foreign investment, or remittances, or things like trade. So understanding what happens within a city versus what happens between cities and your hierarchic position in this global system is actually the new planning of the 21st century. Matchmaking, processes happening beyond our city to what we do in the city. So bringing it back to basic supply and demand, we need to know what is the demand out there in the region, in the country, in the continent, even in the world. What is happening? What are the growth sectors? And how do we matchmake that to the programs and characteristics and planning of our cities? Which brings us back to education, for instance. South Africa, are the universities really providing the right education to matchmake changing industries, or as Premier Makura said, even the rise of the fourth industrial revolution? Are we equipped, and are we going to be lagging behind? And it's time that Africa takes that kind of action. So that was the bit of the boring part, the theory. What you see in front of you is now not a drawing, but it's a GIS map, a digital map of real data. And it's based on a database that I've developed over the years of over 250,000 investments from city to city across the world. And what you see in front of you is actually only the top 1,000 investments, because if I would switch on the whole database, it would just be crazy with lines, so you wouldn't understand much. But what this does show you, these are the top investments that have taken place between over 12,000 cities in the database. And what you see, of course, is the unevenness of capital. So you can see that a lot of investment takes place between Europe and the US and Pacific Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, a little bit going to South America, but very little of the top capital goes into Africa, besides into Accra, Lagos, Joburg, Nairobi, and a few places like that. So even though Johannesburg, which is actually great to know, is 104th in attracting investment out of 12,000 cities of the world. So it is, in Africa, the true global contender. And that's something interesting to know. We should build on that knowledge. It's also, of course, very much what we do in the continent, but Johannesburg has that unique position to also be a global hub in global investment. And how do we promote that and take that further in the future? Now, what you also see here is that investments from the global south to each other are actually not as much as we expected, so it's kind of a myth busted. We can also say, let's see all investment that goes only into Africa. And now we see in this map, all investments in a period from 2003 to 2016, all investments that have taken place in Africa. And what you see here is, despite the bad colonial past, one good thing that remains from that is cultural and language similarities are very much determining flows of capital from Europe. And so Europe still remains the primary region of investment into Africa. We do see that places like China are getting strong linkages. So there's a lot of investment coming from China, especially in terms of their growth of investment into Africa. And the US, especially the east coast of the US, being a primary zone investing in Africa. So out of these cities in Africa, Johannesburg holds a second position. So Cairo is actually the city that receives the most investment. And that has to do with things like being close to Europe, but also getting a lot of investment from the Middle East. So those kind of things matter. But most invested cities are in the north, so in North Africa, and southern parts of Africa are more places like Nairobi, Lagos, and Johannesburg. This is an analysis. We did a forecast. So for the whole continent of Africa, it has been, of course, in a decline after the global recession, but you do see after that dotted line, you can see a forecasted expectation of a gentle rise in investment in Africa. So Africa's problem is that it basically is following the world economy. So it's not that Africa growth has gone down, it's basically because it's quite connected already to the world. It follows the pattern of world development. So the world, you'll see the same, higher growth rate, but for Africa, more gentle. But this is what would happen if you did nothing. Of course, we are here today to talk about what you should do in Africa, and that would make the growth exceed what we see here. This is the same analysis, but now looking at South Africa, and we do also see again that luckily around the elections, there will be a rise again of investment into South Africa. Again, this is basically, if you don't do anything, following the trend of what happened, what you can expect. But if we do a lot in South Africa, and especially in the Gauteng province, we can, of course, change the scenario and make it much stronger. In this map, we only look at investment taking place between African cities. So here you can see already the fundamental role of places like Lagos and Johannesburg. You can clearly see that Johannesburg is a primary investor in Africa already. And other places like Cairo and Casablanca in North Africa also play a strong role. So this is just looking at total investment, but you can actually do the analysis for 52 separate sectors to find out which are the most important sectors and the connections taking place. And lastly, I want to show you, this is the foreign investment clusters in Johannesburg, Gauteng region. The red dots are the actual investments that took place in that period of time. And of course, you can see it following neatly the northern suburbs trail. And we can understand from that it's got to do with tourism, it's got to do with wealth in these areas. But you also see the disparity of it, that we don't see any foreign investment in the Soweto areas or in the east part of Johannesburg and the south part. So somehow foreign investment also reinforces inequality, especially spatial inequality. And studying these kind of things and trying to break that pattern to bring the foreign investment into other parts of the city becomes very important. It's an infrastructural question because you have to attract investors there. They don't have a bias where they go, but they will look for certain qualities when they go to invest and locate. And what we can learn from this is that we have to also start changing areas like Soweto to make sure they can accommodate the qualities that the multinationals need to pull them that way. So in a snapshot, this was a whole story going from the world to Africa to Gauteng. And the report will come out at the end of the year, so I hope you will have time to look into that. But it also shows you only the beginnings of a new way of planning the continent. Of course, this is what we managed to do in a period of 2 years. Many researchers are involved in this, but the knowledge and the beginnings of this are the things that we might need to have for our future development. So monitoring investment continuously, having an agency in the city that can monitor continuously changes of investment and the position of cities will become very important to investors, but also to planners and the public sector. Thank you very much.
That's a very big thank you to Professor Wall, and we're going to ask Prof to please join us so that he can have an opportunity to defend some of his ideas if they are challenged by the panel and the live audience that we have here with us today. I'm going to come to you first, Mustafa, and I'm going to give you an opportunity just to reflect on some of the key points that resonated with you. But I thought maybe you could just start for us by just sharing with us the Office of Overseas Affairs and Investment in the city of Lagos in Nigeria. What is your key mandate, and how do you execute on that mandate? And then we'll hear some of your thoughts from Professor Wall. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Office of Overseas Affairs and Investment, we are barely less than 2 years old. We were set up by this present administration, by Governor Akinwumi Ambode when we came in. And that came from the political philosophy of His Excellency that the government does not have any business being in business, and that what the government should do is to create an enabling environment that makes it easy for investors to come into the country. What is our budget size? 625 billion naira, so which is about $1.something billion. It's not enough for us to be able to provide jobs, increase our GDP, and do all the necessary things that we need to do. So the goal of our agency, which is the only IPA in the entire country that is a full-fledged ministry cited in the office of the governor, is to make sure that we act as one-stop shop for all investors coming in to do business within the country. So we match a will-be investor with local investment partners, do some of the vetting for them. We have an aftercare department that does make sure that you can go through all the various red tapes, which Premier John said that we should declare war on. Same thing, My Excellency is of the same opinion. And we are making sure that we are following on the government's objectives, making sure that the ease of doing business is promoted. So you are not waiting 2-3 years to get your permit to be able to build. You are not waiting to be able to register your businesses, although some of the issues are beyond us because we are subnational, but we have an effective cooperation with the national level. So there is an ease of doing business committee by the acting president, so we have a relationship with them. We are working with the World Bank also to improve the ease of doing business within the state. So once again, our objective is to act as one-stop shop to make it easy for businesses that are coming into the country, and especially to Lagos State, because we are responsible for 70% of the FDIs that is coming into Nigeria, so they do not have any constraints inhibiting them from investing in Lagos.
Thank you very much for that. And following what we've just heard from Professor Wall, I did see you taking extensive notes. What has resonated with you? And please feel free to challenge some of the ideas if they are not reflective of your own experience.
It kind of reinforces what we have been saying, looking at investment coming into Cairo, to Johannesburg, before to Lagos, because of the proximity. Cairo is very close to Europe, very close to Middle East. So the affinity is there. And one of the things that I latch on from the speech of the Premier, and even at dinner yesterday, there is one important element in the partnership that we are trying to build with Gauteng. When the Premier is sitting with My Excellency, you see an African man talking to another African man. And we come from the supposition that South Africans have an inherent responsibility to the rest of African countries. You have the patient capital, you have the technology, we have the demand, we have the population. So that is a marriage of convenience. You bring your technology, we bring our demand, and we can create the growth that will uplift the GDP, uplift the lives of the people. We are building a rail line in Lagos. We've invested close to 100 billion. Why do we need to go to Alstom in France? Gauteng is there. Why can't I partner with them? We've just created a mandatory health insurance program for 20 million people. We need radiology, diagnosis, and medical equipment. We need to be able to tap into that. The power requirement in Lagos is 20,000 megawatts. we have a program where we are using our balance sheet as a government to support the generation of electricity, about 3,000 megawatts over the next 2 years. Why are we not seeing those South African companies, helping to build power stations, transmission stations, investment in gas? We are doing Clean Lagos initiative, which makes it, so one of the things that His Excellency is doing is making sure that the framework is right to attract private investment. We have a sound PPP investment law that has been in operation since 2005. We have a World Bank-supported procurement process. So, and we have a vibrant judiciary where we are promoting alternative dispute resolution. So, and we have, we are modifying our civil administration processes, so we are not tied up in litigation. We have a multi-door civil process resolution so that your cases, your investment is sound. Although there are some things that we cannot control, like the vagaries of the economic policy in terms of foreign exchange, but we do the best that we can in making sure that you can increase your investment. So all the stories, the special analysis that has been done by the professors clearly reinforces what we have seen. We need to improve our education, our workforce. We need to improve our middle class. We need to make it easy for people to come and invest in our country. And the affinity we have to. There is a sizable South African elite that schooled in Nigeria. So when they're talking to us, they have the familiarity. Yeah. We were at dinner yesterday with somebody, with one of two of the promoters who went to school in Nigeria, and they still have friends. That is the basis. So when somebody from France is going to Republic of Benin, they can speak French. That is their affinity. When an American is going to Philippines or Canada, that is their affinity. Why can't we not take advantage of that as well?
Thank you very much for those insights. I think they're absolutely brilliant. And one of the things, of course, Bernadette, that Mr. Mustafa has raised is this convenience of marriage. And I'm sure that you will have some insights that will help us understand whether South African companies and Johannesburg-based companies are exploiting the opportunities available in the African continent. But let me first give you an opportunity to respond to some of the insights that have been shared by Professor Waugh.
Absolutely. I really do encourage intra-Africa trade. I've actually exported and I've traveled extensively into Africa, and there are huge opportunities in every sector and in auxiliary services. And one of the tools available, which I find is such an advantage and beneficial, are the trade agreements in place, which really gives companies the competitive edge and just eases and facilitates trade. And I think companies should really make use of the existing trade agreements in place. And as I mentioned, I've traveled and done extensive business in the healthcare industry in Africa. And there are huge opportunities as well in the auxiliary services as well.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. So reinforcing that the opportunities do exist, very much in line with what we've heard from the Overseas Affairs and Investment Office. Let me come to you, Rashid. I mean, one of the things that Prof ended on, he said, some of what has been shown in this research is that this could lead to a new way of planning. And of course, you're responsible for planning in the Gauteng City Region. When you see this data and this piece of research, what are the key things that are resonating with you? And do you believe that this is going to lead to a new way of planning?
Yeah, maybe I should just start and say I'm actually the head of planning for the Gauteng province, not the Gauteng City Region Observatory. And I think that's an important point because we sit in the Premier's office, and we've picked up this idea of the Gauteng City Region. So it's not just Johannesburg, it's understanding this new phenomenon of city region that's emerging across the world, where you have major interconnections between a polycentric kind of arrangement within not just Johannesburg. We've got Johannesburg, we've got Tshwane, we've got Ekurhuleni, and we've got the two districts, all of which play an important role in the broader space economy, as it were. So from a planning point of view, we have to look at some of the spatial issues. How do we densify the urban core and ensure greater efficiency of our infrastructure and our investment? How do we ensure effective transportation planning? How do we ensure food security? One of the issues raised by the professor as well. So from a planning point of view, it's that kind of notion of the city region that we animated by at the moment, and we think is a really important issue. It's not simply an issue of the formal governance arrangements as in the three spheres of government as we understand it, but at a different level, how do we begin to knit together the entire city region? So, and I think the issues that he's raised, I think they're very sort of insightful, and they give us a sense of how do we position and launch pad ourselves in relation to other cities and city regions across the continent.
I'd like to stay with you, Rashid, and pick up on another point that the Prof raised, and I think repetitively that we need to guard against just attracting consumptive investment and really begin to think deliberately about productive investment. What are your thoughts on that, and do you have any ideas of how that can be done?
Well, I think there's a general sense that, well, firstly, if you look at Gauteng's economy, we do have a relatively diversified economy. And I think that's really important because it means that we can prevent shocks from taking place. We know some city regions are affected by sort of commodity-based economies, and when things sort of plummet, everyone feels the pain. But I think that there is a sense, and certainly the Premier's agenda has been one of reindustrialization, but not just sort of becoming the workshop of the world as China has been historically, but it's actually moving away from that particular trajectory. How do we look at other forms of advanced manufacturing so we can pick up on the new wave, the fourth industrial revolution, etc. So I think that's certainly where we want to, and that will further diversify the economy. Just to make the point, I think for example, the green economy is really important as something that we would look at, because it's both, the issue is both about long-term sustainability of the city region, but also the kind of investments that we're looking for.
Thank you for that, and I'd like you to add to that very question on just ensuring that we are directing investment into productive sectors and not just consumptive sectors. And I'm asking you the question because oftentimes when stats are being thrown around the demographic changes that we're seeing on the continent, I think one of the most mind-blowing ones that I've heard is that I think by 2050 or 2060, 1 in 4 Africans will be from Nigeria. And an investor in the consumptive space looks at this and says, this is a consumptive market opportunity. Is there scope to redirect investment into more productive sectors, or do you just run with the consumptive opportunity?
Yeah, it's the responsibility of any African government to make sure that you are redirecting the investment where you feel is necessary. So for us in Nigeria, for instance, and especially in Lagos State, so that is why it's gladdening when you have somebody like Dangote who is setting up a refinery. So we want to be able to maximize our natural resources. So as opposed to exporting crude oil, we want to be able to refine and build some of the added value chain so we can grow our fertilizer industry, we can grow our petrochemical industry, we'll be able to make plastic, we'll be able to, from the plastic that is created, set up a subsidiary so that we can set up a phone manufacturing industry in Nigeria. So it is essential for us to make sure that we are encouraging and deepening the industrialization base of the country and kind of tactically shifting from a consumption base. Because when you keep consuming, the money you'll be sending money out, and that puts a lot of pressure on your foreign reserve. But if you are increasing your capability to be able to expand and take advantage of those natural resources so that you are building a very detailed value chain. So I can grow potato now, turn it into paste, and as opposed to going to Florida to go and get a concentrate and mixing it with water. So which is not a value add for me. It is a better value add for me to go to Jos or to go to Lagos, grow potato in Lagos, have a value chain where I can clean it, or even take a cattle, for instance, so I can, take advantage of the leather to be able to create a leather industry within the country and deepen my own industry base. If I deepen my own industry base, I can increase my middle class. Once I am able to increase my middle class, I can increase the purchasing power.
Yeah.
Then I can start building all those service industries based on that. But if I keep consuming, I can't survive as a country.
I think that's a brilliant point. Prof, I'm going to come to you on the skills base, but before I do, Bernadette, one of the things that I think really intrigued me from Prof's presentation was looking at investment flows within the Gauteng region and seeing how they further deepen inequality. And in my head, I immediately said Gauteng versus Soweto as a way of simplifying it. Here's an extension of the question. When South African companies go into Africa, to what extent are they paying attention to the socio-economic dynamics that are underlying? To what extent are they looking at the Gauteng-Soweto dichotomy in those particular markets and investing in a way that doesn't deepen inequality? Is that even a lens that we're thinking about?
Also brand, I found also in various countries in Africa, they're very brand conscious. And also to really develop and market the brand. And the importance of marketing the brand.
So,
Yes.
so just to make sure that I understand, African consumers are very brand conscious,
Yes.
and so brands will be the key drivers of where the investment goes.
Absolutely.
And does that mean that the brands will probably have a higher visibility in the urban centers, and so again maybe mirroring some of the trends that we're seeing in Gauteng?
Absolutely, and they're actually prepared to pay the higher price even to get that brand, that particular brand they're looking for.
So, Prof, that's an interesting layer to add to that model that you showed us. Yeah. But just before we go to break, and before I bring in the audience, I would love you to just an opportunity to reflect on some of the responses. But one of the key things you shared with us is that the biggest risk that we have where we become passive bystanders observing the fourth industrial revolution and observing investment is if we continue to lack the skills base. And it seems as if it's a base that doesn't seem to even matter when investors are looking at the African continent. How do we do this in a way that is accelerated, that is practical, and that puts us, as the Premier said, at the center of the fourth industrial revolution?
So what we showed I didn't show that part, but we actually did an analysis testing manufacturing, services, high-tech and resource FDI's impact on reducing inequality. What we found is that manufacturing and high-tech increase inequality unless you connect it, so you add another piece of data to it, what we call absorptive capacity of the city. And what happens? The sign switches. So it goes from a negative effect, all of a sudden it reduces inequality. And actually the message behind that is absorptive capacity means how skilled and capable are the local population to take on high-end jobs from the multinational. If not, then we always will get the middle range or lower type jobs. So that's a very important message to our universities. And it was already mentioned by the Premier today, is how to matchmake this world of sectors. Can be local, can be regional, national, continental, or global. We need to monitor what is the changes in sectors, what are the high growth areas, what are the ones that will be most sustainable for us to attract, and then make sure our universities are dynamic. The faculties should be able to adapt quickly to changes in the economy. And in that sense, you will have an output of graduates who can take part in the high-end sectors. Otherwise, what these multinationals do, they bring their own people, they do all that type of work, and we consume the goods. And that's what's happening across the continent. We also see it in another analysis we did. The effect of wage differences in African cities has no impact on foreign investment, which simply means it's not a cost for them. It's so marginal, doesn't matter. So as the African Union, we should talk about setting minimum wage standards and talking about how to make ourselves competitive in wages with other cities in Asia and in Latin America, and even with the real developed world. So this kind of thing will definitely change inequality. And we also have to take away the perception that the foreign investors are bad. Basically, they're business people trying to make a profit, and obviously they're not altruists. So they simply want to get a good deal. And as you asked, do they care about inequality in social structure? They don't. They don't. Well, of course, what they say is it's actually the municipalities and governments. They must tell them what to do.
Yeah.
We have to choose with our municipalities the right sectors, and we have to make the right policies for investors, and also rules about probably even where you locate, so that you try to distribute capital across the city. But if not, you will see across the whole world, actually, the pattern of inequality replicates itself. Yeah.
I've got about 3 minutes before I have to go to break. So very quickly, let's bring in the infrastructure thread, Rashid. One of the key things that was raised by the Prof was proximity to markets, and that was very, very important. And we know that infrastructure then becomes the base of that conversation. Do you think that we could be doing more in terms of ensuring that even in planning within city regions on the continent, that we make the interconnectivity between cities as a key priority to attract investment?
Yeah, maybe I just want to handle the question in this way and say that just on the issue of inequality, the one thing that strikes me is that it's not simply a function of what investors do, as Prof was saying, that as government, we have a responsibility to look at more broadly quality of life issues as a whole, so that we kind of progressively working towards addressing problems of inequality through the provision of basic services, of education, and so on. And the infrastructure that underlies it is the essential kind of component. Because remember, infrastructure is not only, doesn't only have an economic function, it has an important social function as well. So, and we have to understand this in a holistic way. So that I think for me the issue is we want to create cities, city regions, and societies that are sustainable and resilient. And not just look at it in a kind of narrow way. So from our point of view, that's the agenda. And how does then FDI and investment basically, further that particular agenda?
And on that point of how do we create the right spaces to bring foreign direct investment and just to get investment, private sector players playing their part in investing in infrastructure that connects cities in Africa is a key point. So we're going to take a short break now. But when we come back, we're going to be allowing our live audience here at Gallagher Estate to bring their voices and bring their insights into the conversation through a facilitated question and answer session. If you've just joined us, the hashtag that we're using on Twitter is GIIC 2017, and we're looking at the readiness of African cities to investment. Hello and welcome. If you've just joined us, we're coming to you from Gallagher Estate at the Gauteng Infrastructure Investment Conference for 2017. In the first half of this show, we've really given our panelists the opportunity to respond to some of the key insights and thoughts that have been raised by Professor Ronald Wall. And in this greater conversation of looking at the readiness of African cities to attract investment, the conversation has been robust and some of the insights have been really interesting. At this point, though, we turn our focus to our live audience that has joined here today and to give them an opportunity to bring their voices into the conversation. Now, remember, you too can be a part of this conversation. Tweet us and let us know what your thoughts and your questions are, and we'll see if we can integrate those into the conversation we're having here today. So we're crossing over to the floor now. Sir, may I give you the floor? Kindly please introduce yourself and ask your question.
My name is Oscar Mola from Joy Mineral Trading and Exchange. My question is that how do we prevent investment not to go outside of our African continent? As they've been studied, they've been shown that there's a lot of money that is going out offshore account from Africa. an Africa living in poverty, where there's enough resources that was supposed to change the life of Africans?
Thank you very much,
And
Oscar.
the policies, and how do we address?
Thank you very much. I've noted your question. So how do we compete against offshore investments? What can we do from a policy perspective to get that right? There's, sir, please, if you've got your hand up, I might kindly ask you to stand so that the roving mic can get to you very quickly, madam, with the roving mic.
Thank you very much. My name is Richard Bennett. I'm a property developer. There was a statement made at the beginning of the discussion that government does not have any business in being in business. My question is around the potential impact of cryptocurrencies. And given that cryptocurrencies have a huge potential to be the currencies of international trade in the future, essentially because they're borderless, and that these currencies are effectively encrypted and therefore outside of the control of government. If government's then real role is to act as the enabler for business, would this not have some impact on the difficulty of collecting the necessary taxes or funds that are required to act?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Richard. A very straight and direct question on cryptocurrencies. I am taking the question at the back. Please stand, sir, madam, and ask your question. Thank you.
I have a suggestion and then a question. The suggestion is the conveners of the conference should have invited university students to be part. Because if we are talking about Africans coming up with African solutions, they are part of that equation. That's one. Number two, the question of why are Africans not engaging in more intra-Africa trade? Is it not because of perception? What we have been through as Africans in terms of colonization, do we not see each other as less than? Therefore, we are quick to go to Europe and the Americas for trade and investments instead of trading with our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Nogwazi. Great questions and an insightful suggestion. I'm going to take the two hands that I've noted here and I'm going to close my round. Sir, I've seen you. Please go ahead, sir.
I thank the panel for all the presentations since yesterday, but I have a concern. I research a lot on stakeholder management, and we define stakeholder management as individuals who have interest or the right on project or investment. And I have not heard any of our panel talking about the engagement on the stakeholders who are African or the invisible stakeholder who we don't always see on the investment. And what that means is today stakeholders are more informed today than yesterday. And I believe for any investment to have a good impact on anything, we need to get them involved on that. How can we get involved stakeholders on the investment in Africa?
Thank you, Dr. Wembe, for that question. We've taken our questions from our live audience here at Gallagher Estate, and we transition back to our panelists now to give them an opportunity to respond. One of the first questions that have come through is that of competing for offshore investments. Again, I think we know that you didn't get enough time to go through all of your slides, but what are your thoughts around whether the residents within Africa are choosing offshore investment opportunities over investing in Africa? And if that is the case, is there a possibility of turning around that tide?
So I think within all investment into Africa, Africa is the third biggest region of investment into itself. And you have Europe and the US above that. And I think the Middle East and Africa are both big investors in Africa. So also an interesting one to think about. So a lot of investment is coming from other parts of the world, but also African cities are in general also investing more in other places than in Africa. So the growth of investment within Africa has been increasing, but there is definitely a lot of investment to other parts of, even to the US. So to my surprise, Gauteng is a big investor in smaller towns in the US, so not in the big ones. So the question is whether we have to limit, the offshore side. I think what we should do is concentrate more on how to increase the investment within Africa, but not to therefore circumvent investments that might go elsewhere, because that's also beneficial. Also considering that it's your position also in the world system that actually gives you great advantage in the future. Now, Johannesburg, with 104th position in the world, is already an amazing advantage, and that is also to great extent to offshore areas. So I wouldn't say we should try to limit it. What we need to do is concentrate on how to increase the investments within Africa. And that will depend on many things, one being infrastructure. The other one is simply policy at the AU level. I think we have to readdress policies at the AU level, how we collaborate together, how we work together, what are the conditions for investment, and what are we trying to achieve? Huh?
Right.
What is a better Africa? Is it simply high growth for the lucky few, or is it a dispersion of that money into the greater continent, especially where 60% of the continent's youth are unemployed? It's a fundamental problem. If we do not address that, it's going to have enormous repercussions. Yeah.
So very quickly, before I move on, I'd like to tag on the question that Nogwazi raised around perception perhaps being a key variable that is limiting or constraining intra-Africa trade. The map that you showed us showed that there continues to be economic relationships between African markets and the former colonizers, if I can put it like that.
Yeah.
So let's put on this layer of whether that is also contending with the fact that, according to Nogwazi, Africans perhaps think that we are lesser than to each other, and so we prefer to trade with external partners and the former powers.
I think that's a very good question. I definitely think economy is psychology. Yeah? So basically, there is a perception of Africa as the resource continent. And as I showed you in the results, it's actually now one of the knowledge-intensive continents. Huh? But nobody knows that. So one fundamental thing is research. What we have to do is focus on investing a lot into empirical research in the continent. We need to understand better what is going on and then create the policies, but also the messages for the continent which are positive. There is a lot of positive messages for the continent over the last 20 years, and we need to get it out there because it influences investor perceptions for investing in the continent. But when you actually see the rise of knowledge-intensive industries, things like renewable energy, healthcare, consumer products, all these things are showing a different perspective on Africa. So definitely the psychology has to change, but we also have to make sure to change that perception. We should stop only getting high-end research institutes like London School of Economics, NYU, all these guys to do research for us. We need to maybe use them to teach some of our kids, then to teach the rest of the continent. And that, I think, is a fundamental change we have to do. We need to get research to be done by Africa itself, for itself.
And Rashid, I suspect you'll probably agree with that. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that and to pick up on any of the other questions. But I would like you to respond to the question that was raised by Richard around cryptocurrencies being the currencies of the future. How do we plan for it, knowing that this could actually raise issues like not being able to tax because they are borderless in every sense? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess the issue is that we're certainly entering a new wave. I mean, part of the sort of the whole fourth industrial revolution discourse is about a lot of these new technologies that, that are coming about. The emergence of the internet in the last quarter of the century, I think, has meant that a lot of the rules of the game have changed. And I think that our regulators need to look at that issue. I think what we can't do is resist, I think, a wave that we're seeing. So, for example, there's this whole idea of a cashless society and the use of cards and so on. I mean, that's one of the things that in countries like Sweden, it's up to about 60% at the moment. Cryptocurrencies are another form of it. And I think that, well, the main issue is that we'll have to find ways of actually ensuring that, I'm saying the regulators need to find those particular examples.
Thank you for that, Rashid. And Bernadette, there's a question from Mr. Sibanda, and his question gets to understanding how companies in South Africa can be supported to access new markets. Although his question really rested on, how much capital do I need? We know that it's much more than capital that is required in order to penetrate a new market. Can you give him some insights around what he should be thinking about?
Absolutely. I must say, before one actually looks to penetrate a new market, extensive research has to be done, and there DTI plays a major role. DTI offers various incentives, where they'd actually do market research. So I would say engage with the DTI on that as well, and also various government departments. But before entering a new market, first undertake quite a bit of market research before you go into a new market.
Thank you very much for that, Bernadette. And a final response, and I'm sure so you have a lot of comments on some of the earlier questions, and you're invited to reflect on them. But the question that came from Dr. Wembe, and Dr. Wembe says that he feels that we've missed the focus on stakeholder management, although we spent an extensive amount of time talking about partnerships yesterday and how important these are in the investment agenda. Do you have any thoughts about how do we get to the granular level where we start thinking about how are we actually managing stakeholders so that those partnerships can be practical and fruitful?
We were having a conversation yesterday, and the Premier was saying the next time he goes out, he wants a plane full of business people from South Africa. He doesn't mind taking the taxi. I mean, and that has to be the thinking. When you go out, to facilitate business transaction, let the business people talk to the business people. So South African Chamber and Nigerian Chamber of Commerce, maybe probably even set up a Gauteng, Lagos local Chamber of Commerce to take a look at, what are those businesses, or which are those businesses that are interested in coming to Lagos. And some of the existing planning forum that you already have, the Ministry of Planning, one of the things that catalyzed investment in gas in Lagos was a feasibility study that was done by USAID. So you now have to find within the system here, maybe through IDC or TDI, so that, I'm talking about some of the initiatives in Lagos State that we are about to do, making it easy for people to register title, working with Thomson Reuters to automate the land administration process, making it easy to create a secondary mortgage market. So these are things that need to be studied. We were at GIFA the other day, and they have a lot of market visibility study. And they were able to take a concept, from a concept to bankability. So what a will-be investor needs to do is just take those detailed analysis that has been done and be able to make informed business decisions. And so, once again, so you have to, for you to do an effective stakeholders management, engage those businesses, leverage on the Chamber of Commerce, leverage on the AU. The AU should not just be talking about politics. When you talk about politics, carry the business people along with you so that when you finish your political discussion, the business people can have business discussion. So you have the Nigerian president saying, we have a new refinery. Can Saxo come and work with me? Can your power generation ESCOM come and work with me so that we can increase the capability? So that facilitation between a premier to another premier with the businesses there will help make it easy for the various stakeholders, and you have all the TDIs and all the other framework to support those businesses.
So as a way of closing this conversation, I'd like to acknowledge the conversation that's happening on Twitter. Lita is saying, as a South African entrepreneur, I'm encouraged to pursue opportunities beyond borders. And I think that's a beautiful way that really ring fences the core of the conversation that we have been having here today. As we wrap up the conversation, I'd like to give you an opportunity to name the next report that's going to be landing on the desk of the Gauteng Premier. The title of the report is African Cities Need To, and your responsibility is to complete the sentence. And I'm going to start with Prof, because Prof, we assume that this is your daily activities, putting reports on tables. So African cities need to?
Need to increase outward investment.
African cities need to increase outward investment. Thank you for that. Rashid?
African cities need to be resilient and sustainable for outward investment.
Resilient and sustainable. Bernadette?
Need to export.
Need to export. And finally, Mr. Mustafa?
Innovation and creativity.
They need to be innovative and creative. Well, I don't think I could have wrapped the show on a better note myself. African cities need to increase outward investment. They need to be resilient and sustainable. They need to improve and increase exporting capacity. And they need to be innovative. And they must never forget to be creative. It's been a fantastic show with some robust conversations coming through from our panelists today. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. For CNBC Africa, I'm Nozi Pombandra.